The Sino-Soviet split was one of the most decisive ruptures of the 20th century because it exposed in the most brutal and unmistakable way the ideology that overrides power, that even systems claiming universal truth fractured the moment supremacy is contested. What began in the late 1940s as a seemingly natural alliance between the two largest communist states in the world gradually transformed into suspicion, hostility, and near war, shaping the Cold War from a simple bipolar confrontation into a far more complex and dangerous triangular struggle. When the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the Soviet Union appeared to be its obvious patron and elder brother. Moscow had already industrialized, possessed nuclear weapons, commanded ideological authority over global communist movement. For Mao Zedong, however, the relationship was never one of submission but of temporary necessity. China emerged from a century of humiliation, civil war, and foreign domination with a revolutionary leadership that believed it had discovered its own path to socialism, rooted not in industrial proletariat of Marxist theory but in the peasantry mass mobilization and continuous revolutionary struggle. This difference was not cosmetic, it was existential. From the start, China's communism was not a copy of Soviet model but a rival interpretation, and rival interpretations inside universalist ideologies are intolerable over time. The alliance initially functioned because interests aligned. China needed industrial aid, technical expertise, and diplomatic protection, while the Soviet Union wanted a massive ideological and geopolitical ally in Asia to counter the United States. The 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship formalized this partnership. Soviet advisors poured into China to help build factories, railways, and heavy industries. Yet beneath the surface, cooperation lay resentment. The Soviets treated China as a junior partner, extracting concessions, controlling technology transfers, maintaining privileges that reminded Chinese leaders uncomfortably of imperialist behavior. Mao never forgot that China had replaced one hierarchy with another. The Korean War intensified both cooperation and distrust. China paid the human cost of fighting the United States directly, while Soviet Union provided material support and avoided direct confrontation. From Beijing's perspective, blood had spilled while Moscow calculated safely from behind. This imbalance planted the seeds of future accusation that the Soviet leadership was cautious to the point of cowardice. The real rupture began after Stalin's death in 1953. Stalin, despite his brutality, represented ideological rigidity and revolutionary authority, qualities Mao respected and mirrored. When Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin in 1956 during the secret speech, condemning his cult of personality and crimes, Mao interpreted this not as reform but as betrayal. De-Stalinization was in Mao's eyes a declaration that the Soviet Union was abandoning revolutionary purity for bureaucratic comfort. Khrushchev's doctrine of peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West horrified Beijing. To Mao, class struggle was not a phase, it was a permanent conditioning, and compromise with imperialism was ideological surrender. The Chinese leadership accused the Soviet Union of revisionism, arguing that it had ceased to be a true socialist state and had instead become a conservative power protecting its own interests under socialist rhetoric. What looked to Moscow like prudence in a nuclear age looked to Beijing like weakness and treason. Personal animosity between Mao and Khrushchev sharpened these ideological differences in open hostility. Their meetings were marked by insults and mutual contempt, and cultural disdain. Mao saw Khrushchev as an uncultured peasant who stumbled into power, then diluted Marxism to preserve his position. Khrushchev saw Marx as an reckless, dogmatic, dangerously willing to risk nuclear war for ideological posturing. The clash of personalities mattered because both men embodied their states. There were no institutional buffer capable of moderating their rivalry. When the Soviet Union abruptly withdrew its advisors from China in 1960, halting hundreds of projects, the split became irreversible. This withdrawal crippled Chinese industry in the short term but convinced Beijing that dependency on external power was intolerable. China would pursue self reliance at any cost, even famine and isolation. Strategic disagreements deepened the divide further. China sought Soviet assistance in developing nuclear power as a guarantee against American coercion. Moscow initially promised support but later reneged, fearing both Chinese unpredictability and emergence of a rival nuclear power within the communist camp. To Beijing, this confirmed that the Soviet Union intended to monopolize strategic superiority while keeping China subordinate. Regional conflicts exposed the absence of solidarity even more starkly. During the 1962 the Sino-Indian War, the Soviet Union adopted a neutral stance and maintained relationships with India, a non-communist state. For China, this was an unforgivable act of betrayal. Ideology had been subordinated to geopolitics, proving Beijing's claim that Moscow's socialism was hollow. By late 1960s, ideological polemics had escalated into military confrontation, along with long and purely demarcated Sino-Soviet border tensions erupted into armed clashes, most notably in Zhenbao Island in 1969. This was not symbolic skirmishes but serious engagements involving artillery, large troop deployments. Both sides prepared contingency plans for full-scale war, including nuclear strikes. The image of the socialist world as a unified bloc collapsed completely at this moment. Two communist giants were close to annihilating each other than to confronting capitalism together. This was the ultimate proof that the Sino-Soviet split was not a misunderstanding but a structural rivalry driven by power, security, and leadership of global communist movement. The consequences of the split were immense. China reoriented its entire foreign policy, identifying the Soviet Union rather than the United States as the principal threat. This strategic calculation led to one of the most dramatic realignments in modern history, rapprochement between China and the United States in the early 1970s. Mao and Zhou Enlai welcomed Richard Nixon to Beijing not out of ideological conversion but of ruthless realism. By leveraging the American hostility towards Soviet Union, China broke out of isolation, gained diplomatic recognition, and secured strategic breathing space. The Cold War was transformed from a bipolar confrontation to a triangular balance of power, weakening the Soviet Union by forcing it to confront two adversaries simultaneously. Over time, this strategic isolation contributed significantly to Soviet overstretch and eventual collapse. In a broader ideological sense, the Sino-Soviet split shattered the myth of communist unity forever. Communist parties around the world were forced to choose sides, fragmenting the movements, draining it to coherence. The split revealed that Marxism-Leninism was not a monolith but a flexible language just to justify state interests. Nationalism, not proletarian internationalism, proved to be true driving force. China's later economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping would complete this exposure by demonstrating that the Communist Party was willing to abandon orthodox socialism entirely to preserve power and national strength, a trajectory made possible by earlier rejection of the Soviet authority. Ultimately, the Sino-Soviet split stands as a hard lesson in power politics. It shows that ideology is a tool, not a bond, that alliances based on shared doctrine collapses the moment strategic interests diverge. Two empires cannot share leadership, two centers cannot command the same ideological universe, and two revolutionary states tolerate a rival claiming equal legitimacy. The split was not a tragedy of misunderstanding, but an inevitability born from ambition, insecurity, and brutal logic of dominance. In destroying the illusion of a communist unity, it reshaped the global order and demonstrated a timeless rule. Systems fracture not when beliefs differ, but when power is contested.